Tom Deegan is a researcher at the Democracy Forum UK, and he has expertise on South Asian issues, and he's been very long supporter of World Sindhi Congress, and wherever we call him, he do come. So Mr. Tom Deegan.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this important forum. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this forum. I'm going to change the subject a little bit and talk a little bit about history and about one of my personal heroes, a man called Allah Bucks Sumru. I would like to start by pointing out that the creation of the state of Pakistan was not done in the interest of the Muslims of India. It was done in the interests of the West. It was done in the interests of British imperialism, protection of capitalism, rather than the interest of Muslims. Muhammad Ali Jinnah is usually given credit for the creation of Pakistan, which is why they refer to him as Baba-i-Kian, the father of the nation, but in fact he was simply an instrument of British imperial design. For many, many years before the Second World War, the British knew that they had to get out of India. They could no longer hold back the tide and the demand for Indian self-determination. They were prepared to grant it, but on their terms. They wanted to ensure that India remained a client state, if possible, of Britain. And today they're trying to make sure that India remains a significant trading partner of India. The two-nation theory, which I should point out also that Muhammad Ali Jinnah was originally a United India man. He opposed the idea of partition because he recognized that the idea that India could be divided into Muslim and Hindu states was nonsense. The Muslim people were scattered all over India. There were only a few minor states, relatively speaking, that had Muslim majorities and Hindu minorities. The rest of India had Hindu majorities, but significant Muslim minorities living within them. The states such as Sindh had a Muslim majority, but it had a large Hindu population. Punjab was divided between Muslim and Hindu populations. So the problem with the British was that most of the Indian national leaders were socialists. They were left-leaning. They had sympathy, many of them, with the Soviet Union. And the British were terrified that a united India, which would have been a very, very powerful economic and potential world power, would end up being allied to the Soviet Union rather than to the West. And so they encouraged Mr. Jinnah. The king met Mr. Jinnah when he came to London during the war and encouraged him to stick to his guns. He met Churchill and Halifax and other British world leaders before the partition actually occurred, and he was helped and advised to maintain his stance that the Muslims could not live in a society ruled by Hindus or Christians or any other religion. Muslims have lived as minorities in many different countries around the world and have suffered no ill effects as a result. The fact is that the British wanted a separate northern state as a buffer between India and the Soviet Union. That was the geopolitical strategy of the day. That little or nothing to do with the protection of Muslims. In fact, the creation of the state of Pakistan was a betrayal of India's Muslims, because there were more Muslims left outside the new Pakistan that were contained within it. There was, however, a fly in the ointment when the proposals for Pakistan, the creation of Pakistan, was being mooted by the Muslim League at the time, led by Jinnah. That fly in the ointment was a man called Allah Bux Sumru, who was a leader of the Sindh people. He was the Prime Minister of Sindh. He was the founder of the Ittihad Party, and he was absolutely opposed to the idea of partition. And he had the support of the Sindh people because of his reputation and his logic. He had to be removed. And so in 1942, during the war, Sir UOW, the Viceroy or the Governor-General, sacked him, dismissed his government. Allah Bux Sumru won some power again, and he was again dismissed by the government. They replaced his Ittihad Party with an alliance of Muslim League and Hindutva, members of the Indian National Congress, an unholy alliance produced for no other reason than to give an alternative to the Ittihad's objection to partition. And as if that wasn't enough, Allah Bux Sumru was assassinated a few months after he was deposed or sacked by Sir UOW. He was assassinated, probably by the Muslim League. Nobody was ever called to account for his murder. He was shot dead riding in a tanga, on the tanga carriage on his way through the streets of Karachi, I believe it was. I think that very few people in Sindh today would know very much about Allah Bux Sumru, because the only hero they know about is Jinnah, the father of the nation. But Allah Bux Sumru was a hero of the Sindh people. He recognized the truth of partition for what it was, what was its intention. And when India was divided, the Muslims of India were divided. Those that were left inside India were that much weaker politically, and the Muslims in the north, well, they didn't really gain very much. They've all fallen under the hands of a military elite, gangsters in uniform, is the way I describe them. Many countries have generals. Pakistan's generals have a country under their control. They're also among the most wealthy individuals on the planet. If you see an Indian general or a British general in retirement living on their relatively modest pensions, often attending book signing sessions to try and supplement that modest pension, no such thing has to occur with Pakistani generals. They're all fabulously wealthy. They all own properties in London, and they do very, very well out of the state that they own. My own country, Ireland, I'm Irish by the way, spent 700 years attempting to gain its independence from the British. I simply hope that Sindh people do not have to spend 700 years trying to win independence for their nation. However, I can do no more than wish you the best of luck in your endeavours. Thank you.